On Thursday, Sir Keir Starmer unveiled what he's called his, or Labour's, 5 bold missions. They're going to form the basis of the party's manifesto for the next general election. Starmer made a speech in Manchester and he said that Labour would make Britain the fastest growing economy in the G7 and promised to reform the NHS. Well, joining me to discuss this now, I am joined by the writer and political commentator, John Oxley. John, what do you make of the 5 missions? What are the 5 missions?
So, the one that caught all the headlines is to make Britain the fastest growing economy in the G7, which is the sort of leading countries in the world economically. But also there were a few domestic ones. So the next one was about the green energy transmission, supercharging Britain as a green economy, moving towards net zero.
Yes.
Then there was pledges around reforming the judiciary and crime, building the efficacy of the NHS and reforming education standards as well.
OK, so this is kind of like a teaser for what the manifesto ultimately will be when it comes to the general election, because it's a bit light on sort of policy specifics, isn't it?
That's exactly it. I mean, Keir Starmer, the way he framed it was he's setting where he wants to go, but the detail will follow later.
Fair enough. Do you think that Labour are the party to boost the economy? Because historically, maybe not so much.
Well, I think in the early Blair years they did, but they inherited an economy that was already growing. The question is whether they can take one that has been struggling for so much time. And the real question when you get into that is, the how and the why, because 4 or 5 months ago, Liz Truss came in saying she was going to grow the economy, she was going to do it via tax cuts, and we all know what happened next.
Yes.
The question is, if you're Keir Starmer, and you're probably not going to want to offer tax cuts to the rich, what can you put in place and isn't going to work?
Yeah, but he's not saying that, is he? I mean, he's not giving us the specifics of how he's going to do it, from what I understand it. He is suggesting that it's going to take 2 terms. He's saying that sort of by the end of his first term, you'll see some signs of growth. What do you think he's going to do if it's not going to be tax cuts for the rich?
I think probably you're going to see perhaps more spending than was seen previously. I think you will probably see some elements of, if there are tax cuts, they will be aimed at the poorest. There will be probably increases to government spending around people who receive benefits and things. But I think the question is, what big levers can he pull? The one a lot of pundits talk about is housing reform, but that's a hugely difficult thing to try and get on the table and get through.
So why do you think he's made this announcement now? I mean, isn't it the case that the general election for him is pretty much in the bag anyway? So, I mean, this isn't necessarily about winning people over, is it?
Well, they say a week's a long time in politics, and we've got over a year until the next general election. I think what Keir Starmer is trying to do, there's a lot of people who are still on the fence. OK, they don't want 5 more years of the Tories, but are they going to turn out and vote Labour in sufficient numbers to give him a big majority? And I think what he's trying to do is say to those people that we do have a plan, and if they're people who voted Conservative in 2019, whether that's in the Red Wall or whether it's even in seats in the South, it's to say, look, I'm not Jeremy Corbyn. My plan isn't nuclear disarmament and nationalising anything I can see. It's here are some sensible pro-growth policies that are going to fix your problems.
Yeah, so this is very much about sort of winning those floating voters. And there's a lot of people to be won over, aren't there? There are a lot of people who would never, traditional Labour supporters who weren't happy with Corbyn and that idea. And then there was the Red Wall, as you mentioned. So that's what this is about, really. But the Conservatives are a hell of a lot behind. 20 points, I think, behind?
About that. And, yeah, I think Keir Starmer's looking at that and thinking, how do we keep it together? Which is why he's not going for radical blockbuster policies. It's what can I say that sort of builds into this sense that I'm the Prime Minister in waiting and I've got things to do when I get there.
What is he talking about with the judiciary? What does he mean, reform the justice system?
I think there's a number of... I mean, I can't read into his mind, but I think looking at it from a Labour perspective, you're going to want to tackle crime, you're going to want to appear hard on crime, but you're also looking at all of the problems we've seen, for example, in the Metropolitan Police and other police forces, and so you're looking and saying, well, I'm going to get conviction rates up, I'm going to get crime tackled, but I'm also going to make the police an institution we can trust, and potentially then you start to look at things like criminal sentencing, which is very hard to sell on the left, but is a great thing to come in and promise to moderate voters and conservative-leaning voters who think, let's get some people locked away for a long period of time will actually help dealing with persistent criminals and serious criminals.
I mean, that is a major concern of people, isn't it? At the moment, when someone breaks into your house, people often don't bother contacting the police because they don't think anything's going to be done about it.
Yeah, there was some stats in the Times today that showed, the conviction rates for almost every crime have fallen into low single figures. And there's a huge sense that basically what the police exists for now is you call them up, you get a number that you can report to your insurance company and you get paid out, and that's where the story ends. So I think it's a big thing that if Labour can get a plan together that really engages with people's concerns on that, there's a huge electoral dividend.
Can he be trusted, though? I mean, like, during his time as Director of Public Prosecutions, I mean, he made some terrible mistakes, I think. I mean, for one thing, it was really under his tenure that this idea that complainants started to be referred to as victims, which completely bypasses the notion of due process. You know, he was the one that effectively helped to politicise the CPS, so we had the disaster of Operation Midland. I mean, he can't wash his hands of that, can he?
No, I think there are serious questions about stuff that happened, but, you know, now is his chance to try and set out his stall. You know, he's facing a government that have made all sorts of mistakes over the last 10 or 15 years, and no politician is perfect, but they're going to have to come to us and say, these are my ideas, this is how I'm going to achieve them. I think these 5 missions is the starting point of that. The question is, what comes after? Because, you know, when I look at what politicians say, I think the first test you always apply is, could anyone disagree with that? And you look at the 5 things he said, and there's very little anyone could disagree with. And you need to get into the meat, the things that some people are going to have an issue with, to really see what he's going to deliver and how he's going to push these things through.
So I suppose we'll see it when the manifesto turns up, how he's specifically going to do this.
I think we will see it when the manifesto turns up, but I also think this is a signal. You know, Keir Starmer has spent the last couple of years sorting out his own house. He's been dealing with the problems that he inherited in the Labour Party. He's going to be looking and thinking an election can come any time between now and, you know, early 2025, I think, is the very last date. So he's going to be sort of starting to set the rhythm. He's going to be setting out these ideas and building on them so that when the manifesto drops, it's not a complete shock, but that he's laid the groundwork that people see him as a Prime Minister in waiting.
So does Rishi really have a hope in hell? I mean, you know, a lot of voters say that one of the problems is that they don't really see any difference between, you know, the managerial technocratic style of Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak. There's basically the same thing.
I think, you know, there's a lot of coalescence in the middle of that, but Rishi Sunak, you know, he's got time, he's got power at the moment, but the big problem he has is, you know, Conservative Party are in disarray internally. It's hard for him to get anything through. If he wants controversial stuff through where his backbenchers are going to say no, he's going to have to rely on Labour votes, which only plays into Keir Starmer's strengths. It's going to be very, very difficult for Rishi Sunak. There is a path there, but it's a very, very narrow one.
A lot of people are concerned, though, of the influence of critical social justice ideology within the Labour Party. You know, Keir Starmer has struggled to observe that women don't have penises. He finds that difficult. And I think a lot of people are worried about that. Is he deliberately playing down all of those sort of issues, particularly now that we've seen what that kind of cultural war discourse does to a politician in the form of Nicola Sturgeon?
I think almost certainly so, and it's a problem that Keir Starmer faces that's, you know, the exact opposite. The Rishi Sunak has the problems with the right of his party. Keir Starmer is always going to have the problems of the left of his party. And you have to sell this stuff internally, and you also have to show the wider world that you're not in hock to these views that many people see as extreme and concerning. So I think what you are going to be seeing is him, you know, trying to downplay those elements, but also making the pitch that if he comes into power with, you know, a majority of 80, he's less beholden to a small number of MPs in the same way that if you get a big Conservative majority, they can face down rebellions. So that's also part of his pitch. You know, back me in big numbers, and I don't have to worry as much about the nuttier side of my party. We can just ignore them.
Very interesting point. John Oxley, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much.